Hello, my name is Kennedy Rainey, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the history of African Americans. I'll start with the first chapter of African American history, which is slavery. In middle school and high school, I'm pretty sure you all learned about slaves and how they were forced to pick cotton and were whipped on a regular basis. But if that wasn't harsh enough, they were also being raped, taken away from their families, and even lynched. They also couldn't read or write and were denied the right to even do so. During slavery, there were many people who played a significant role during this period. For example, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman took multiple trips to the South to lead slaves to free states. She risked her life with a bounty on her head just to lead slaves to freedom. Harriet Tubman was also one of many conductors who were part of the Underground Railroad. But for the way that she led the slaves to freedom, she went down in history as one of the greatest conductors to lead the Underground Railroad. Even though she played a very significant role during slavery, she was not the only one. Another person who played a significant role during slavery was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass also played a significant role in the period of slavery. Frederick Douglass was one of the first slaves to be able to read and to write. With his ability to read and write, Frederick Douglass went on and he wrote an autobiography. He also wrote a couple books about his life as being a slave. While I'm on the topic of talking about what African Americans were and weren't allowed to do in this period of time, I'm going to talk about African American involvement in the war. The first war I'm going to talk about is the Civil War. African Americans were at first not allowed to join. On the other hand, they were forced to be laborers. But as the Civil War progressed and moved forward, they saw that not a lot of white people were enlisting to fight for the war. So African Americans were forced to fight in the Civil War. If they lived in the North, then they were lucky enough to fight for the Union. But if they were a slave in the South, then they were fighting for the Confederacy, which was fighting to keep slavery. Another person who played a key role during the slavery/Civil War period of African American history was Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln made the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. This declared that any slave that was held in the states that were against the Union were declared free. However, this didn't free all of the slaves. It just freed the ones in the states that were against the Union. After Abraham Lincoln saw how the Emancipation Proclamation was going, he thought that a little more was going to be needed for slaves to officially declare their freedom. So a couple years after the Emancipation Proclamation was created, Abraham Lincoln created the 13th Amendment. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, declaring that all slaves, no matter what state that they lived in, were free. Continuing with the war period of the history of African Americans, taking to World War II. African Americans played a very significant role and World War II. World War II started a little before the Civil Rights Movement started. So with that being said, that meant that the African American soldiers that enlisted in World War II were kept separate from the white soldiers that enlisted in World War II. A lot like the Civil War, during World War II, African Americans were not allowed to be on the front lines. They were more likely to be laborers or do work behind the scenes and not have the same rights that the white soldiers did. This leads me to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were a group of African Americans that were actually the first group of African Americans to be pilots in World War II. People may have believed just because the Tuskegee Airmen existed and that they were the first black pilots, that the African American race could only go up from here. But soon after World War II ended, this is when the Civil Rights Movement was beginning to start. The Civil Rights Movement was a point in time where African Americans were fighting to have the same rights as white people. This was a very important time in the history of African Americans. I'm pretty sure you know about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks because it's the most peaceful thing to talk about. You may even know about the peaceful protest and maybe even know about the March on Selma. But what you probably don't know is that on top of the inequalities that African Americans faced, they were also being abused by police, bit by dogs, and even being hosed down with fire hoses. During this time, there were really only two options that you could choose from. It was either that you peacefully protested or you fought back. This leads me to talk about a specific person, which was Malcolm X. Malcolm X was an opposite of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was the one to peacefully protest. Malcolm X, on the other hand, was a person to fight fire with fire. Malcolm X contributed significantly during the Civil Rights Movement. He fought for African Americans to be considered as equals up until the time that he passed away. During the Civil Rights Movement, there were many people trying to get African Americans the rights that they deserve and to be considered equal as other people. This leads me to talk about a very important case during the Civil Rights Movement, which was Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education followed a previous case, which was Plessy versus Ferguson. And this stated that racially segregated facilities were legal just as long as they were equal to each other. This is why the case Brown versus Board of Education was created, because the black schools were not equal to the white schools. And since the schools were not equal, it actually violated the 14th Amendment, which was the Equal Protection Clause. During the Civil Rights Movement, there was a lot of police brutality and police killing African Americans just because they wanted to have the same rights as them. On this slide, I have chosen two pictures. One from the Civil Rights Movement and another picture that was from a recent incident. Maybe you're thinking that these two pictures have a lot in common. which they do. Nothing has really changed from about 50 years ago to about 2 or 3 years ago. And over the past few years, the amount of police brutality has increased, especially the amount of police brutality that has been against unarmed African Americans. And even though African Americans have been through adversity upon adversity, they continue to prosper. African Americans began to start breaking barriers from backdoor slavery with Frederick Douglass and him being the first slave to be able to read and write, to Jackie Robinson with him being the first African American to play Major League Baseball, to Thurgood Marshall being the first black person to be on the Supreme Court. This barrier leads me to talk about one of the most recent barriers that was broken, which was the first African American president, Barack Obama. Barack Obama was elected president of the United States of America in 2009, and he served 2 terms. During the 2008 election, there were 2 million more black people that came out and voted than the other election. In my opinion, African Americans should take the chance to vote because they were given the right to. People fought and people were killed and they died for African Americans to just have the right to vote. And with that being said, I believe that African Americans should take advantage of all the rights that were given to them. And this concludes my presentation on the history of African Americans.